In this video, you're going to learn how to replace a faulty USB C port on a PS5 controller. Maybe you've tried cleaning the inside of the port, but that hasn't fixed the issue, which means you're going to need to completely replace the port. Doing that means you'll need to take the controller apart and desolder and resolder a new port onto the controller's motherboard. So if you're not very comfortable or don't have much experience with microsoldering, I'd recommend trying to find a local repairer to complete this repair, or try and find a microsoldering course in your area so you can learn the correct techniques. Also, throughout the guide, we're going to be using a bunch of different parts and tools. We'll be showing what these tools and parts are throughout the guide, and we've also linked them all in the description below if you do need to purchase any of them for your repair. Okay, now let's get into the repair. So before continuing, just make sure your controller is powered down. Next, get a spudger, insert the flat end into the gap above the L1 button and pry the bottom up and out of the controller. Put your finger or thumb over the button to stop the button from flying out of the controller across the room. Do the same for the R1 button. Next, use tweezers to pry underneath the middle trim in the bottom left and right corner to release it from the clips securing it to the case. Now lift the middle trim upwards to help further release the clips. You can then lift the center of the middle to release it fully from the controller. Now you can use a Phillips 000 screwdriver to remove the two screws securing the bottom corners of the lower case. Once that's done, you can remove another two Phillips screws behind the L1 and R1 buttons at the top of the controller. Next, using a spudger, unclip the two clips on either side of the headset jack. Now you can remove the rear case. It's a bit stiff and doesn't come off easily, so use a spudger where you can to help pry it away. The first thing you'll need to do when the case is off is disconnect the battery from the motherboard by pulling the battery connector out of its socket and then lifting the battery from the battery bracket. Next, remove the Phillips screw securing the battery bracket. Now you can remove the lower microphone ribbon cable pull tab from the motherboard by disconnecting it with tweezers. You can then lift the battery bracket and lower microphone out of the motherboard. You can now disconnect the left and right trigger assembly ribbon cable pull tabs from the motherboard. Next, disconnect the touchpad ribbon cable by pulling it straight out of the motherboard connector. Next, disconnect the upper microphone ribbon cable from the motherboard. Using a black marker, mark a black dot next to the solder joint the black vibration motor cable is connected to, so when resoldering you know where it goes. Next, you'll need to desolder the vibration motor cables using a soldering iron. If you're struggling to melt the solder, you can add flux to make it easier. Now you can remove the motherboard from the controller and then remove the joystick caps. Next, we're going to be removing the USB C port. Start by adding flux to all of the solder points that need desoldering on the USB C port. Next, use hot air at 360 degrees to melt the flux applied to the port. As it starts to melt, you can wiggle the port with tweezers until it comes free. With the port removed, you can then use solder wick to remove the old solder from the pads. Make sure all of the solder pads are completely flat before moving on. If you're struggling to remove some of the solder, change to using only the solder tip. This will apply more heat and make it easier to remove the solder. You'll also need to make sure that the pins from the old port are removed to ensure the new port sits flush and can make a proper connection. To help remove the solder, you can apply fresh low melt solder to the ground holes so it mixes with the old solder, making it easier to remove. When you finish removing the solder, add flux to the solder pad the new port will be soldered to. If you don't, the solder won't flow properly and will cause cold solder joints that look like they are properly connected but aren't. Using a hot air station at 320 degrees, heat the flux until it becomes molten and then apply the new port. The next steps are going to need to be completed under a microscope. You'll need to solder the pins and then use tweezers to check if the pins are attached properly. Next, you'll need to use the soldering iron to heat the ground leg of the port and the hole on the board, then add solder. Finish up by cleaning the port with IPA. Pop the motherboard back into the controller and then resolder the vibration motor cables back to the motherboard. You can now reattach the left and right trigger assembly ribbon cable pull tabs to the motherboard. Next, reattach the upper microphone ribbon cable to the motherboard. Now you can reattach the touchpad ribbon cable to its connector. Reattach the battery bracket with a single Phillips screw and then reattach the lower microphone ribbon cable pull tab to the motherboard. Now you can reconnect the battery to its socket. Refit the rear case, making sure the clips click properly in place. Reattach the two Phillips screws behind the L1 and R1 buttons, followed by the two screws in the bottom corners of the lower case. Finally, you can reattach the middle trim. And that's it. That's how you replace your joysticks on a PS5 controller. I hope you found this guide useful. If you did, give this video a thumbs up and click the subscribe button if you want to see more repair content like this one.